Right, let's pick up where we left off and let's start talking about distributor. Now, distributor is going to allow us to package our own software to install on our managed instances. So it essentially allows us to publish software to install. So you'll see some ones that are provided here. For instance, Amazon CloudWatch Agent, and this is going to install the CloudWatch Agent on our instances that we specify. So let's just see what creating one looks like. I click on Create. We can do Simple or Advanced. And let's just go ahead and do Simple for the sake of the length of this video. We give our package a name. We can give it a version. We specify where we want to pull this info from. And you can see my version was wrong. So what I would do is I could specify the URL. We would add software as needed. We would create a manifest which shows what's being installed and what version this is. And then we would create our package. And then using our distributed package, we could select it, install on a schedule, or install one time. So if I do install one time, once again, it brings us to our run command documents, because documents are how Systems Manager operates. It all operates on documents in the background. So you can see we're configuring a package. We're installing. Here's the name of the package. We can specify the version. We do the same old thing where we select our resource group. Our parameters, we'll skip all this. I won't write to S3. And then what I would do is I would run this. So if I click on Run, what this is doing is if we had a managed instance in that resource group, it would run and install that CloudWatch agent on that instance. And there we go right there. So success. And you can see that it installed CloudWatch agent with this version number on our server. So now on that instance, we have CloudWatch agent installed and we can configure it to push to our log groups for centralized monitoring and logging. Now we'll talk about CloudWatch in depth later on, so I'm not going to go into that on this. I just wanted to show you how distributor works for distributing our own custom packages or Amazon provided ones. So let's go ahead, let's take a break here, and then when you're ready, we'll move on to shared resources where we're going to look at documents at a deeper level. Okay, welcome back. Now let's dive into SSM documents, which falls under the shared resources section in Systems Manager. Now what I have here is an example or a snippet of an example from a document within AWS. Now don't worry if you don't understand what this is doing yet. In the upcoming clip, we'll actually dive into the console, start playing around with these documents, and then demoing how these automations work. It's important to understand how these documents work because everything automation-wise within Systems Manager essentially runs from an SSM document that tells it what to do. Now, this is from the AWS Create Snapshot document that's provided to us. And the first thing we see is we have our schema version and our description. So we're creating an EBS volume snapshot. And really quickly, you'll notice that this format is in YAML. It supports both JSON and YAML, but YAML is easier to read, and it's usually a preferred format due to the readability. The next thing we have is our assume role. So which IAM role do we want to assume for this task in order to perform our actions? So for this one, since we're creating an EBS volume snapshot, we might want to go ahead and assume this role that has capabilities for performing those snapshot API calls. The next thing we have is we have our parameters. So we can set parameters like volume ID here, and then we can reference those parameters later on in our steps so that we can perform actions using their values. So in this example, we're providing a volume ID, and you can see it's required. And then we have our description, and that's optional. And you can tell it's optional because obviously it says it, but we provided a default for them so they don't have to fill it out. Since there's no default in volume ID, this is a required input. After we get our parameters all set up, we move on to our main steps. So these are our automation steps that we're performing. You can see we have our name, which is create snapshot, and then we have our API action. You can see it's running execute AWS API. And with this action, we provide our inputs. And our inputs are our service, so EC2. What API are we calling? Create snapshot. We're referencing that volume ID parameter from above, as well as the description. So now you can see how our steps tie in with our parameters for use. And then when it's all said and done, we have an output section. So we can output certain values if we want. And in this example, their payload output is selecting the snapshot ID value that comes from the result of the snapshot, and it's outputting it to the console. So now that we've broken down this automation document to give you a general understanding of how they work, let's actually start looking at the documents in the console. We'll make some changes to a couple, and then we'll actually execute them as well. So when you're ready, go ahead and move on, and we'll continue. Okay, let's dive into shared resources. So now that we have all of the other capabilities out of the way and we understand them and how to use them, I want to talk about documents. Now, documents under shared resources have been mentioned several times, and that's because they are critical to how Systems Manager works. All of these commands that we looked at run based on an SSM document. And there are several different types. There's session, policy, run command, and even change calendar documents. Now, documents, like we saw in the presentation, can be written in YAML or in JSON. So it offers some flexibility and allows you to write in whichever syntax you prefer. Now, this is the default screen here, and you can see we have owned by Amazon that loads right away. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to create my own document to show how it works. So what I did is I went ahead, this is the default version that AWS provides us, and this is that same create image automation that we used previously in earlier clips. It basically has us provide an instance ID, a role, a boolean for rebooting or not to reboot, and then it creates an image. So it creates an AMI based off the instance ID that we supply. Now what I did is I made my own version building off of that, and we added some more details. So you can see we now have this AMI name section that lives within this document. It's optional, and we provide a default of Pluralsight super secret image. Also, you'll notice under main steps right here, I added a change calendar check for this document. So the very first step, it's going to check the change calendar that we have in place, and if the desired value is met, which is open, it's going to go on to the next step and create this image here, similar to what we did before. But if the change calendar state is actually closed, it's going to fail. Now, I just have abort on failure right here, but in a normal use case, you'd want to more than likely go ahead and go to a different step that handles that resolution. For the sake of this demo, to keep it a little bit shorter, I just went ahead and chose abort. So what I want to do here is I'm going to go ahead and copy all of this code, and let's go up to create automation. I'm going to give my document a name, and that brings us to the builder or editor selection. So this is a newer feature. SSM now allows us to use this builder section to build out essentially this script in a friendly manner. So you can see the assume role, the outputs, input parameters, etc. Everything that we defined over here is in a nice and pretty GUI that we can use if needed. Now, I do recommend that you always put your config files in some type of repository. So my suggestion is to always figure out how to code it in JSON or YAML. That way you can version control what's being deployed. Now, one really cool feature here is this markdown. I'm not going to go into depth on markdown, but this allows us to build in a description, and you can see the preview over here on the right that describes what this document is doing. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to actually click editor. And what this does is brings me to the document editor screen. And when I click edit, it's going to say, hey, if you do this, you can't go back. So I'm going to click OK. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of all of this, paste in my JSON code that we had, and I'm going to click on Create Automation. There you go, success. So now if I go to Owned by Me, you'll see our document over here, Secret Image Creator. So we have our description, the different steps that occur. We can view the different versions under here and here. We can look at the content of the document, and we can look at details. Now under details, really quickly, this is where you can share your document with other AWS accounts. So you can specify your account numbers here, or you can just make it public for the general public to use. So if you had a centralized account that hosted all of your systems manager documents, you could share it out to your organizational units that belong to your company so you have a central location to manage them. Now I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to go back to description, and I want to just load really quickly Change Calendar. So let me open up a new tab, and I just want to show you what I've done. I created this Global Mantics blackout calendar, and you'll see at the top it's open by default. So that means events can occur anytime outside of our event windows, remember. And what I did is I created this little blackout period from today through Saturday. So in theory, when I run this document, it should fail. So let's just go ahead and try it. I'm going to go to Execute Automation. It brings us to our automation screen that we've seen before. I'm going to go ahead and fill out these values really quickly. I'll go down to Execute. And there we go. So now what I'll do is I'll pause this clip and let this run. And then when it's done, we'll resume. All right, that was actually extremely fast. You can see that we have an overall status of failed. And it's our first step, which is our check calendar, that failed. So if I go into our step ID, we can see our failure details. And you can see it saying, hey, the property value we got was closed and your desired output is open. So we're going to go ahead and abort like you specified. So that's how we can look in deeper to the failure messages that SSM provides. Now, if I go back to our change calendar, let me go ahead and erase this blackout period. So now we should be open to do things. I'm going to go back to automation, and I'm going to redo that automation task. I'll fill out the same values, and let's click execute. So once again, I'll pause really quickly, and once this is complete, we'll pick back up and start talking about it. All right, awesome. So you can see we've had success on both steps, and if I go to outputs, you can see we created a new image and it's available. So if I go to AMIs, which I opened up in the meantime, you can see our brand new image that we just created. So this automation document that we created worked. So that's how you can create your own document in order to run commands in Systems Manager. Now, one last thing really quickly, I want to show you how we can make different versions. So if I go in here, I can go to Actions, and I can create a new version. So if I go to Editor, let me edit and accept. And I want to go over here, and I created an additional JSON file that has an additional parameter in it. And I'm going to click on Create New Version. All right, so now if I go to Owned by Me, Secret Image Creator, you can see our default version is 1, but we have a second one that we can choose. To make number 2 or our second version default, I'd go to Actions and set a new default version. I would select 2 and then click Set. And there we go. So now if I go back in, you can see the default version is 2. And the difference here is I added a AMI description that we can populate as a parameter. Everything else is the same. So that's how you can version control within AWS to a certain degree your different documents that you use for automation purposes.